I thought she was just a woman who loved her son a little too much. The kind of mother-in-law you roll your eyes at during the holidays, then forget about by New Year's. I had no idea that for the better part of 8 months, Eleanor had been walking through my front door while I was at work, sitting in my kitchen, going through my mail and photographing every document she could find with her phone. The spare key I had offered her on moving day, a gesture so small and thoughtless I barely remembered making it, had quietly become the instrument of the most calculated invasion I had ever experienced. And the notebook I found hidden behind the radiator in the guest bedroom told me exactly what she intended to do with everything she had found. Let me go back to the beginning. Not the real beginning. Not the wedding or the afternoon. I first shook Eleanor's hand across a restaurant table and thought she seemed perfectly pleasant. Let me go back to the version of my life that still felt safe before I understood that perfectly pleasant had always been a costume she wore for occasions. Daniel and I moved into the house on Clover Street in early March, 2 years into our marriage, and 1 year after we had agreed we were both ready to stop renting and start building something real. It was a 3-bedroom Victorian on a tree-lined street with a bay window in the front room that caught the afternoon light in the most extraordinary way. Gold and warm and generous, the kind of light that makes a house feel like it has been waiting for you. The back garden smelled of wet earth and old roses every time it rained, and the kitchen had a wide farmhouse sink and original flagstone floors that stayed cool underfoot, even in the middle of summer. I had fallen in love with it the moment our estate agent pushed open the front door and the hallway smell had reached me. Dust, old wood, some faint trace of another family's life, and underneath it all, something that felt unmistakably like possibility. I had signed the mortgage entirely in my name. My income was higher. I worked as a senior marketing manager for a pharmaceutical company in the city center, a role I had spent 7 years working toward. And my credit history was cleaner. Daniel had suggested the arrangement himself one evening over dinner, practically, without sentiment. It simply made more financial sense. He was a project manager at a construction firm, steady and reliable, but his income was subject to the rhythms of contracts and delays. I had signed the papers without hesitation. The house was ours in every way that mattered, I told myself. That was what I kept telling myself. I loved that house with the fierce and particular love you feel for the first thing you have ever truly owned. I loved the sound the radiators made at night, a low metallic ticking, like the house settling into its own bones. I loved the creak of the third stair, which I knew by feel in total darkness. I loved the way the kitchen smelled of wood smoke on cold evenings because the flue wasn't perfectly sealed, and Daniel kept meaning to fix it and somehow never did. Every weekend I painted a wall or refinished a floor, and I put myself into those rooms the way you put yourself into something you intend to keep forever. Fully, trustingly, without holding anything back. Daniel, in those early months, was the man I had married, patient, warm, funny in that quiet way that people who were once very shy tend to be funny, considered self-deprecating, always more interested in listening than in speaking. He came home most evenings by 6:30, and we had a routine that was domestic and small and perfect in its ordinariness. Dinner at the kitchen table, evening walks when the weather allowed, the sofa, the television that required no emotional labor. I believed we were happy. I held that belief carefully, turning it gently without ever pressing too hard, because some instinct told me that if I examined it too closely, I might find a hairline crack I had been choosing not to see. And then there was Eleanor. I need to describe Eleanor accurately, because it would be too easy and too satisfying to simply call her monstrous and leave it there. She was 63, small and precise, with silver hair kept in a smooth chignon and a wardrobe that ran almost exclusively to structured blazers in navy and gray. She had the manner of a woman who had spent decades being underestimated and had learned very deliberately to use that as camouflage. In company, she was gracious, almost girlishly charming, remembering birthdays, asking about your work, refilling your wine glass before you had quite noticed it was running low. She called me darling in a tone that managed to sound simultaneously warm and faintly proprietary, as if I were a pleasant addition to an arrangement she had already approved. I had never entirely trusted her warmth, but I had spent 2 years telling myself that my unease was ordinary, the natural friction of two women sharing the same man's loyalty, and I had smoothed it over with patience and impeccable manners. I gave her the key on our moving day. It was a gray afternoon in early March, the removal van still half unpacked in the drive, the hallway a maze of cardboard boxes and bubble wrap. Daniel's father had died when Daniel was 17, and Eleanor had raised him alone afterward, working 2 jobs and making sacrifices she had cataloged over the years in enough detail that we all knew the list by heart. I had felt, standing in that hallway with the spare key in my palm, that the gesture was the right one. Generous, inclusive, the kind of thing that says you are not losing a son. You are gaining a home where you are always welcome. I had held it out to her, and she had taken it with both hands and looked at me with an expression I had read, in that moment, as gratitude. I know now that what I had seen in her eyes was something else entirely. It was recognition, the look of a woman who had just received something she had been quietly waiting for. The first strange thing happened in late April, about 6 weeks after we moved in. I came home on a Thursday to find the kitchen carrying a faint but unmistakable trace of Eleanor's perfume, a powdery gardenia scent, distinctive as a fingerprint, the kind of fragrance that registers in the body before the mind has time to process it. I stood in the doorway with my coat still on and my keys still in my hand, genuinely confused, and then texted Daniel, "Was your mom here today?" He replied 20 minutes later. "Think she might have popped by, yeah. She mentioned dropping something off. I accepted this without question. Eleanor had a key. Eleanor dropping by was the natural consequence of Eleanor having a key, and I had given her that key, and so the responsibility was mine. I made dinner and thought nothing more about it. But it happened again. A week later. The gardenia smell in the front room, a window latch I was certain I had secured left open an inch. Then again, a cushion repositioned, a candle moved 6 inches to the left, the kind of displacement so minor it lived in the borderlands between noticing and imagining. I mentioned it to Daniel twice. Both times he was reassuring in the same slightly distracted, slightly impatient way. His mother was lonely since she'd retired. She needed company. I should not read anything into it. And I did not. Or I tried not to. I was building a new life, and I did not want to be the kind of woman who made problems out of nothing, who saw conspiracy in a repositioned cushion. Then one evening in June, Eleanor came for dinner, and, in the middle of a perfectly cheerful conversation about the garden, mentioned that we might want to address the grout in the downstairs bathroom before the damp got worse. I stopped mid-reach for the bread basket. The downstairs bathroom was at the rear of the house, past the bedroom. It was a room that had no reason to exist within the sphere of Eleanor's knowledge, unless she had walked through the most private part of our home during a visit I had not been present for. I asked her, lightly, how she had noticed the grouting. She smiled, that smooth, unperturbed smile, and said she had simply been curious to see how we had settled in, that she hoped I didn't mind. I said, of course not. I passed the bread. That night, after Eleanor had gone and Daniel had gone up to shower, I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about the word curious. I thought about what curiosity might look like, in practice, for a woman who moved through my home in my absence. I thought about the spare bedroom, the room we used as a study, and the wooden filing cabinet in the corner where I kept all of our important documents, the mortgage papers, the insurance policies, my employment contract with its salary details and bonus structure, the folder labeled Savings in my own handwriting, which contained our bank statements and the investment account I had opened with my grandmother's inheritance. I got up, went to the spare bedroom, and checked the cabinet. Everything appeared to be in place, or very nearly. The savings folder was where it always lived, but the papers inside were not quite in the order I kept them. The bank statements were face up instead of face down. It was possible I had left them that way. I put the folder back and closed the drawer and went to bed and told myself I was imagining things. By August, I had begun to lose Daniel in increments so small I could not have named the moment the slippage had started. He was still physically present, still came home at 6:30, still laughed when I said something funny, but there was a new quality of absence in him, a deliberate blankness that descended whenever Eleanor's name was mentioned. He stopped telling me about her visits. He had started spending 20 minutes downstairs after I went to bed, and twice I woke in the small hours to find his side warm but empty. And when I went down, he would be at the kitchen table with his phone face down in front of him, wearing an expression I had never seen on him before, guarded, slightly guilty, the expression of a man thinking thoughts he had carefully decided not to share. He always said the same thing, couldn't sleep, go back to bed. There was a Sunday in September when something broke its surface briefly before being covered back over. Eleanor had come for lunch. Afterward, Daniel was in the garden, and Eleanor and I were sitting with our coffee when she said, very casually, still looking at her cup, had I given any thought to what would happen to the house if things ever became difficult? The question settled in the room with the weight of something much larger than its words. I said I didn't quite understand what she meant. She said she only meant that property in one name could create complications in certain circumstances, and she hoped we had discussed it properly. I said we had. She smiled and changed the subject to the roses. It was not the end of it. It was a Wednesday in October, cold and ordinary. I came home 2 hours early because a meeting had been canceled. I let myself in through the front door, and the house received me in what seemed, at first, to be silence, but was not quite silence. From upstairs, muffled by the floor and the closed door of the spare bedroom, came a sound, rhythmic, deliberate. The metallic slide and click of a filing cabinet drawer being opened, searched, and closed. Opened, searched, closed. I stood in the hallway with my coat half off and my keys still warm in my hand, and I felt the floor become uncertain beneath me, as if the ground itself had decided to ask a question I was not prepared to answer. The smell of gardenia hung in the air, faint, unmistakable. I did not call out. Some animal instinct said, wait and watch, and do not let her know you are here yet. I took off my shoes, placed them carefully against the wall, and walked up the stairs in my socked feet, stepping over the third step out of pure habit. When I reached the landing, the sound from the spare bedroom was clearer. And then it stopped. A pause. And then The quiet, considered sound of papers being set down and a phone camera clicking once, twice. The door was ajar. I pushed it open. Eleanor was standing at my filing cabinet in her navy blazer, phone in hand, the savings folder spread open on the desk beside her. She was photographing the third or fourth page of my latest bank statement, methodically, without hurry, in the way of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. She looked up when the door opened. For one fraction of a second, the only truly honest moment I ever witnessed in Eleanor, I saw something move behind her eyes. Not guilt, not fear. Something colder than either. Something that looked almost like rapid calculation. A woman's mind running through options at a speed her expression refused to reflect. Then the blankness came down, smooth as a shutter closing, and she smiled. "Darling," she said, as if I were the one who had done something unexpected, "you're home early." I did not move. I stood in the doorway and looked at her and felt, for what must have been the longest 4 seconds of my life, absolutely nothing at all. Not rage, not betrayal, not even shock, just a vast white blankness, the way the world goes quiet immediately after a very loud noise. Eleanor held my gaze. Her phone was still in her hand. The savings folder was still open on the desk. She did not attempt to close it. "I was just tidying," she said. "I noticed some papers had slipped." "Put the phone down," I said. She looked at me for a moment with something I can only describe as appraisal. A woman measuring the distance between herself and a threat. Then she set the phone on the desk, screen up beside the folder. I crossed the room, picked it up, and looked at the screen. The camera roll was open. There were 11 photographs taken in the last 12 minutes, showing pages of my bank statement, my ISA certificate, and my stomach dropped with a sickening lurch. The front page of my grandmother's will, which I had kept in the same cabinet for safekeeping and had not looked at in over a year. My hands were very cold. I could feel my pulse in my temples, a slow and heavy knocking, like someone asking to be let in. "How long?" I said. I kept my voice quiet because I had already understood that quiet was the only register in which I was going to remain functional. "How long have you been coming here while I'm not home?" Eleanor sat down in my chair at my desk with the composure of a woman who had prepared for this conversation and found it was going broadly as expected. "I have a key," she said. "Daniel gave me a key. I gave you the key," I said, as a gesture, not as an invitation to walk through my home and photograph my private documents whenever you feel like it. I put the phone in my pocket. "We're going downstairs, and you are going to tell me exactly what you've been doing and why." She did not argue. She stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked past me to the landing with the measured pace of a woman heading to a meeting she had called herself. I followed her, and as I stepped over the third stair out of pure habit, it struck me with fresh, cold clarity. She knows about that step. She has been here often enough that she steps over it too. That thought settled something inside me. Not fury yet, but a kind of absolute irrevocable clarity that was somehow worse than fury. We sat at the kitchen table. The afternoon light fell through the bay window in long gold columns, and Eleanor folded her hands in her lap with a deliberateness that told me she had already decided how this conversation would go. I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, distracted and slightly hurried. I said, "Come home. Now, your mother is here." There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds on the line. Not a long pause, but a fully loaded one. The pause of a man who was not surprised, who had been living in the anticipation of exactly this call. "Right," he said. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He was there in 15. He came through the front door and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at his mother and then at me, and in the look that passed between him and Eleanor, quick, involuntary, immediately suppressed, I saw the whole architecture of what had been happening. It was not the look of a man confronted by an unexpected situation. It was the look of a man confronted by a situation he had hoped to manage before it reached this precise configuration. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I laid the phone on the table. Daniel looked at the photographs without surprise, with the expression instead of a man looking at something he had hoped would stay hidden and had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, would not. "Clara," he started. "How long have you known she was coming here?" I said. He glanced at his mother. One glance, fast, reflexive. But I caught it. "She has a key," he said. "I didn't think—" "How long?" I said again. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the wall ticked between us. Eleanor sat with her hands folded and looked at the table with the strategic composure of a woman who had decided to let this scene play out. Daniel looked at his hands. "A few months," he said. So quietly I had to lean forward to hear it. "A few months." I sat with those words and felt their full weight settle into my chest. A few months of keys in my lock, of gardenia in my kitchen, of Daniel saying you're reading into things and she's just lonely, while knowing every word of it. "What is the plan?" I said. "I want to hear you say it out loud." Eleanor said, "There is no plan, darling. There is simply a concern. Daniel has no legal claim to this house. If you were to separate, which I sincerely hope you never do, he would be left with nothing. A man who has lived somewhere for 2 years, built a life here, and has nothing legally to show for it. I simply thought that the situation should be better understood." She said it calmly, carefully, with the practiced warmth of a woman who had rehearsed the words so many times they no longer sounded like what they were. "You thought you'd collect enough financial information to build a legal case," I said. She looked at me with an expression balanced precisely on the edge between pity and contempt. I thought Daniel should understand his options. I went upstairs. I took the notebook from my bedside drawer, where I had placed it the previous Thursday, after finding it behind the guest bedroom radiator and reading the first 3 pages with a coldness spreading through me that I had not been ready, at the time, to fully face. I brought it downstairs and set it on the table between them. Eleanor's composure fractured. Only for a moment. A visible tightening of her jaw, a flicker of something unguarded behind her eyes. But I saw it, and I filed it away. Daniel stared at the notebook as if he were seeing it for the first time. Perhaps he was. The notebook contained 11 pages of Eleanor's small, precise handwriting. The first 4 pages laid out a detailed financial summary of our household. Mortgage balance, my approximate salary, estimated savings, assembled entirely from photographed documents. The next pages detailed what Eleanor had titled Options for Equity Adjustment, including research into adding a party to a property title even without being named on the mortgage. In the margin, in slightly faster writing, D to contribute more visibly to household expenses. Paper trail, important. D for Daniel, her son, my husband. And on the final page, in handwriting that was less neat than the rest, a solicitor's name, a phone number, and the word consultation, followed by a date 3 weeks away. She had already made an appointment. "I didn't know about the solicitor," Daniel said. His face had gone the color of old plaster. "But you knew about the rest," I said. He didn't answer, and his silence in that moment was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Louder than Eleanor, who had begun to speak again, something about family, about his father, about the sacrifices she had made, and whom I found I could no longer hear at all, because the sound of my husband's silence was filling every available space inside me. I looked at him across the kitchen table and felt something in me become very still and very cold, the way water goes still before it freezes. I had been a woman who made peace. I had been a woman who smoothed friction and chose patience and told herself she was imagining things because the alternative was too complicated. I was finished being that woman. "Get out," I said to Eleanor. I said it quietly. I said it in a voice I had not known I possessed until that moment, flat, cold, and absolutely final, with nothing behind it that was interested in negotiation. "Get out of my house. Leave your key on the table." Eleanor opened her mouth. "The key," I said. "Now." She took it from her bag, slowly, deliberately, as if conferring a concession rather than complying with a demand, and placed it on the table. She stood. She looked at Daniel with an expression of compressed reproach. He did not meet her eyes. She left. I changed the locks that same afternoon, ordered the hardware, watched a tutorial, fitted 2 new deadbolts with a screwdriver, and a stubbornness I felt as something almost physical, a heat in my hands, a steadiness I had not expected. When Daniel came back from walking his mother to her car, he found me crouched in the front doorway with a drill. He stood in the garden and watched me work and said nothing, which was, under the circumstances, the wisest thing he could have done. That evening, I texted Rachel, a university friend who had qualified as a property solicitor 4 years earlier, and she came over the following morning with coffee and a yellow legal pad and read the notebook with careful, unhurried attention. "Document everything," she said. "The photographs you've backed up from Eleanor's phone, the notebook, the recorded dates of access, and, if Eleanor proceeds to that consultation, we will be ready." On Thursday morning, Rachel sent a formal letter to the number in Eleanor's notebook, outlining the collected evidence and its implications, and suggesting clearly that proceeding would not be in Eleanor's best interests. Eleanor called Daniel that afternoon. She was, he said, with the careful transparency he had adopted since the kitchen confrontation, very upset. She felt that she had only been trying to protect her son. She felt, he said, and I saw him notice the word even as he spoke it, betrayed. I allowed myself one moment with that word, one moment in which I felt the full, staggering absurdity of it settle over me like a wave. Then I put it away. The consultation appointment was never kept. The notebook remained in Rachel's files. The photographs stayed on my laptop in a dated folder in case they were ever needed. They were not. Daniel and I did not repair things quickly or in the way that certain stories promise. We went to counseling. We had conversations I had been quietly avoiding for 2 years about trust, about loyalty, about the particular damage done by a person who tells you that what you can plainly see is not there. Some of those conversations were the hardest I have ever had. Some were the most necessary. He did not return to me in any single dramatic moment, but incrementally, in small demonstrated acts over time, which is the only form of return that actually means anything. It is spring now. The roses in the back garden have come back. They do every year without being asked, already rooted in ground that was here long before I arrived. The bay window is full of afternoon light. The kitchen smells of coffee and faintly of the fresh paint I have been using to finally redo the back bedroom, taking my time, doing it exactly the way I want it done. This morning I stood in the front hallway before leaving for work, the way I sometimes do. Just standing, feeling the house around me, the flagstone floors, the familiar creak of the third stair, the particular morning smell of old wood, and something that has, slowly and without fanfare, become entirely mine. I looked at the key hooks beside the door. There are 2 keys on them now, mine and Daniel's. There is no third hook. There never will be again. And that, I have come to understand, is not a loss. That is simply a door that is finally, correctly closed.